She was born into a dynasty where bloodlines mattered more than breath, and where daughters were traded long before they learned to speak. Joanna of Austria came into the world with a spine that curved like a question mark, a pelvis too narrow for motherhood, and a body weakened by generations of Habsburg intermarriage. Yet none of this spared her. She was sent away as a political offering, married to a man who recoiled at the sight of her, and pushed into pregnancies her fragile bones could not carry. In Florence, she lived as a ghost in a palace of marble and mirrors, unseen, unheard, unwanted. What she could not know was that her final hours would be whispered about for centuries. A staircase, a fall, a court that moved on too quickly. This is the story of a woman whose body broke under the weight of empire long before her life was allowed to end. Joanna of Austria entered the world already carrying the shadows of centuries on her back. Born on January 24, 1547, in the cold grandeur of Madrid, she was the daughter of Emperor Ferdinand III and Anna of Bohemia and Hungary. Names heavy with power, expectation, and a history of intermarriage so deep that it carved itself into the bones of their descendants. Her birth was greeted with the solemn joy of dynasties. Yet beneath the ceremonial bells and embroidered blankets lay a truth no one dared to voice. This child, like so many Habsburg daughters before her, was fragile in ways that palaces and prayers could not protect. From infancy, her body told a story it would spend the rest of her life repeating. Her spine curved in a gentle yet unmistakable arc, as though bending under the invisible weight of the crown she would one day be asked to support. Her pelvis was narrow and uneven, her gait stiff, her breath often shallow when excitement or fear overtook her. A Habsburg jaw, slightly pronounced, framed her small face, an inherited signature that linked her to emperors and queens, yet also hinted at the risks that centuries of consanguinity had woven into her genes. For the court physicians, these signs were familiar. For her family, they were simply ignored. A princess was meant to serve, not to be studied. But Joanna was more than her deformities. She was observant, unusually quiet, and possessed a kind of solemn intelligence that set her apart even as a child. While other royal children ran freely across polished floors and played beneath tapestries, Joanna watched from the edges, her movements careful, her steps measured. Her tutors praised her mind, especially her grasp of theology and languages. Yet even their admiration came wrapped in the same silent understanding. She was a princess whose body would always betray her. Her childhood unfolded under the rigid moral world of her mother and the religious severity of the Habsburg household. She grew up surrounded by relics, confessionals, and whispered prayers. Duty was the air she breathed, shaping her long before she understood what duty meant. She learned to kneel before altars, even when her spine ached from bending. She learned to rise during long vigils, even when her legs trembled. She learned to smile during ceremonies, even when every muscle in her back protested the weight of her gown. Pain, to Joanna, became less a sensation and more a condition of living. Yet there were moments of gentleness. She had a fondness for illuminated manuscripts, tiny worlds of gold leaf and painted saints. Perhaps because they allowed her to escape into lives untouched by dynastic responsibility. She spent hours tracing the edges of miniature wings, tiny halos, and delicate lettering. Inside those pages, she could imagine a world where suffering had meaning and where fragile souls were held with reverence, not pushed aside for politics. As she grew, her fragility became harder to conceal. The court tailors altered her dresses to hide the asymmetry of her shoulders. Her ladies-in-waiting walked at her pace to disguise her difficulty keeping up. When she rode, it was always with extra attendants. Their presence explained as etiquette but understood as necessity. A princess could be delicate, but she could not appear weak. Appearance, in the Habsburg world, was as much a political tool as treaties. Her mother's death when Joanna was only 8 years old deepened her isolation. Without Anna's strict but genuine care, Joanna drifted further into the quiet corners of the court. Her father, though dutiful, had a realm to rule, sons to raise as heirs, and alliances to secure. Joanna, one of his younger daughters, became both precious and peripheral, a valuable piece on a board she had no power to move. Her siblings formed bonds she felt unable to enter. Her body kept her apart, her mind kept her observant, her heart kept her yearning for a tenderness she rarely received. As the years passed, talk of marriage began to surround her like distant thunder. The Habsburgs were masters of arranging alliances. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. And Joanna, fragile though she was still a daughter of emperors. Her name carried weight. Her womb, whether strong or failing, had political value. She was a vessel before she was a person, a bride before she was a woman, a strategic thread in a tapestry she never chose to weave. And yet, there was no rebellion in her. Joanna had been shaped by a world that allowed no space for refusal. She prayed, studied, obeyed. She believed that God had fashioned her life with intention, even if the shape of that intention was agony. When she looked at her reflection in the polished metal mirror, her slender shoulders, the curve in her back, the seriousness in her young eyes, she did not see a trapped child. She saw someone preparing herself for sacrifice. By the time the marriage contract to Francesco de Medici was arranged, Joanna understood that her path was set. Her childhood had been a quiet rehearsal for the suffering she would endure as a bride. The lessons, the prayers, the pain, they were all shaping her for a destiny she could feel, but could not yet name. She did not know that Florence would receive her with coldness. She did not know that her body would be pushed to its limits. She did not know that her life would end under suspicious shadows. But she did know one thing. She had never belonged to herself. And that was the first tragedy of Joanna of Austria. When Joanna of Austria left her homeland at 18, the journey to Tuscany was framed as a triumph of diplomacy. Carriages rolled through Europe with ceremonial procession, and emissaries spoke proudly of the union between two powerful houses, the Habsburgs and the Medici. But beneath the embroidered banners and scripted speeches, the truth was far more somber. Joanna was not being honored. She was being exchanged. Her departure was less a celebration than a surrender, a final reminder that her body and future belonged to the machinery of empire. The voyage itself was grueling. Joanna, already frail from years of quiet suffering, struggled with the rough roads, the cold winds, and the constant eyes of attendants who monitored her every step. She prayed often, gripping her rosary so tightly that impressions of the beads lingered on her palm for hours. At night, she slept in foreign beds, surrounded by the unsettling knowledge that each sunrise carried her farther from the only world she had ever known. Even then, she sensed that Florence would not welcome her with warmth. But she walked toward it with the same resigned determination that had shaped her entire life. Francesco de Medici was waiting for her, reluctantly. Their marriage had been arranged with political precision, but the man himself had no desire for this union. Reports had reached him of Joanna's stiffness, her severity, her fragile health. He expected little, and what he expected was duty, not companionship. Yet nothing could have prepared him for the first moment he saw her. According to multiple court observers, the disappointment on Francesco's face was immediate and impossible to conceal. He had hoped for grace, charm, perhaps even beauty. What appeared before him was a painfully slender young woman with tense posture, meek movements, and a gravity that seemed far too heavy for someone her age. Her smile, shy and uncertain, did little to soften the impression. To a man like Francesco, raised among splendor, surrounded by confident Florentine nobility, Joanna appeared foreign in every possible sense. The wedding itself was grand, as tradition required, but beneath the music and flowers lingered an unmistakable chill. Francesco stood beside his bride as if fulfilling a duty rather than embracing a partner. Joanna, her nerves tightly bound beneath her jeweled gown, felt the audience's scrutiny like needles against her skin. She spoke Italian carefully, each word chosen with the fear of making a mistake. Her stiffness, already innate, intensified under the weight of unfamiliar eyes. Every step she took seemed to confirm what the courtiers already whispered. Florence had been given a duchess it did not want. That first night in Tuscany unveiled the truth Joanna refused to admit even to herself. Francesco kept his distance, physically, emotionally, instinctively. The consummation of the marriage was treated not as a union, but as an obligation, performed with a cold efficiency meant only to secure heirs. There was no affection, no curiosity, no warmth. For Joanna, the experience etched itself into her memory as a moment of profound loneliness. She lay awake afterward, staring at the carved ceiling, realizing that the husband beside her was already gone in every way that mattered. The palaces of Florence, renowned for their art and magnificence, became for Joanna a maze of silent corridors. Every fresco, every marble column, every glittering chandelier seemed to highlight how little space there was for her in this world of cultivated grace. She arrived eager to learn, eager to belong, but Florence expected its duchess to embody elegance and effortless charm, qualities Joanna had never been taught to cultivate. Her Spanish-Austrian upbringing favored modesty over seduction, piety over social flair, seriousness over sparkle. In Florence, these virtues became vices. Her attempts to adapt only worsened matters. She attended court banquets where she spoke softly, her accent thick enough to amuse the nobles. She wore her hair in styles that seemed outdated to the fashionable Medici ladies. Her dresses, adorned with symbols of her faith, contrasted sharply with the lighter, more lavish gowns worn by Florentines. Even her devout habits, long hours in prayer, frequent confession, avoidance of frivolity, were perceived as odd, almost comical. Francesco noticed all of this, but not with sympathy. His indifference hardened into avoidance, and avoidance into quiet disdain. He spent less and less time in her presence, delegating matrimonial duties to the bare minimum. The more he withdrew, the more the court followed his example. Servants exchanged glances behind her back. Courtiers tittered when she entered a room. Foreign ambassadors described her as severe, melancholic, unrefined. Florence, a city alive with artistic brilliance, treated Joanna as an ill-fitting relic from a different world. Yet the harshest blow came not from strangers, but from the man who was supposed to share her life. Francesco's disappointment became the silent axis around which Joanna's new world spun. He made no effort to conceal his discontent. He entertained guests without inviting her. He attended festivals while she sat alone in the palace chapel. When they did meet, he addressed her with a formality so cold it felt like a wall built brick by brick. Joanna, raised to obey and endure, responded with quiet resilience. She prayed for strength. She studied Italian with renewed effort. She tried to smile even when her heart ached. But no willpower could soften a court determined to see her as an outsider, or a husband who had already decided she would never be enough. In the end, her arrival in Tuscany was not a beginning. It was the first descent into a life marked by loneliness, humiliation, and unending physical strain. She had crossed borders believing she could fulfill her duty with dignity. What she discovered was that duty, in Florence, came with no mercy. Florence greeted Joanna of Austria not with open arms, but with a quiet, relentless hostility that seeped into every corridor, every chamber, every whisper carried through the Palazzo Pitti. The city that dazzled Europe with its art, its humanists, its Renaissance brilliance seemed to dim the moment she stepped into it. In a court where elegance was a second language and charm a currency, Joanna was a foreign dialect, understood by few, embraced by none. Her isolation began with something as simple as language. Although she had studied Italian before her marriage, her words came wrapped in the heavy cadence of Spanish and German. Every sentence she spoke felt clumsy in her mouth, a reminder that she was an outsider in a world that prized effortless fluency. Courtiers disguised their amusement behind polite smiles, but she saw it in their eyes, those brief flickers of mockery. Servants, freer in their opinions, whispered, "La straniera rigida," the stiff foreigner, when they thought she couldn't hear. Even when they were silent, she could feel their judgment the way one feels a draft beneath a closed door. The difference in manners deepened the divide. Raised in the austere, devout atmosphere of the Habsburg court, Joanna had been taught to value modesty, solemnity, and restraint. But Florence thrived on display. Its noblewomen adorned themselves like living frescoes, dripping with pearls and ribbons, moving with an ease that appeared almost choreographed. Their laughter rang like bells across banquet halls, their conversations sparkled with wit. Next to them, Joanna seemed carved from stone, still, reserved, too earnest in a world that worshipped lightness. Even her clothing marked her as foreign. While Florentine ladies embraced low necklines, vivid fabrics, and daring silhouettes, Joanna clung to the conservative Spanish styles she had always known. High collars framed her thin face. Dark colors emphasized her pallor. Religious motifs embroidered into her gowns served as reminders of her piety, and also, inadvertently, of her difference. She was a duchess in black among a court dressed in gold. But what wounded her most deeply was the absence of companionship. Not a single lady-in-waiting spoke her native tongue. Not one shared her customs, her faith, or her interests. Letters home became her only solace. She filled page after page with confessions she dared not speak aloud. Her loneliness, her fear of disappointing everyone, her attempts to win the affection of a husband who hardly looked at her, the exhaustion that clung to her like a second skin. She wrote of the silences that followed her like shadows, the way conversations halted when she entered a room, the coldness of palace halls that no fire could warm. When the responses finally arrived, often weeks or months later, they were filled with diplomatic encouragement, not comfort. Be patient. Fulfill your duty. God rewards endurance. But endurance was becoming a mountain she climbed alone. Her husband's absence made the slope even steeper. Francesco visited her only when required, and even then, stayed no longer than necessary. His voice, always measured and polite, held no warmth. He never asked about her health, though she frequently struggled with pain. He never asked about her thoughts, though her days were filled with prayerful introspection. When he looked at her, he saw the political alliance she represented, not the woman who trembled from loneliness at night. In the rare moments they were seen together, Francesco kept a formal distance that courtiers immediately noticed. Their cold marriage became yet another subject for gossip, And Florence, a city fluent in rumor, wove stories around Joanna with effortless cruelty. Some said she was too devout, praying more than she pleased her husband. Others accused her of being humorless and stiff, unfit for the lively Medici court. A few speculated that she was cursed, her frailty a divine punishment, her sorrow a prophecy. The palace chapel became her refuge. There, surrounded by candlelight and carved saints, she found a silence that did not judge her. She knelt for hours before the altar, her thin hands clasped tightly, her eyes lowered as she whispered prayers for strength. Strength to endure another day, another banquet, another reminder that she did not belong. The servants called her obsession with prayer excessive. The courtiers found it tiresome. Only Joanna understood that prayer was not a habit. It was survival. Yet even faith could not shield her from humiliation. During public ceremonies, when she stood beside Francesco, she could feel the eyes of the crowd lingering on her awkward posture, her difficulty walking, her inability to match the graceful steps expected of a duchess. In festivals, she remained a somber note in a symphony of color. In processions, she was the statue no one admired, but everyone noticed. There were evenings she wandered the palace gardens alone. Moving slowly along the gravel paths, she would pause beneath citrus trees, Florence's pride, breathing in their sweetness as if trying to fill the emptiness inside her. Sometimes she imagined what life would be like if she had married a man who saw her as more than an obligation. A man who might have walked beside her in these gardens, listened to her quiet thoughts, or offered her the tenderness she had never known. But such fantasies dissolved quickly, swallowed by the reality that she had been born into a world where love was a luxury reserved for others. As months turned to years, nothing changed. Florence never softened, Francesco never warmed, and Joanna, already fragile, began to shrink into herself, becoming quieter, paler, almost translucent, as if the city was erasing her one breath at a time. In the end, she lived among hundreds, yet no one truly saw her. Her existence had become a silent tragedy woven into the splendor of Tuscany. A lonely figure wandering through rooms filled with laughter that did not belong to her. Childbirth, in the Renaissance imagination, was meant to be a moment of triumph, a sacred act through which dynasties renewed themselves and women fulfilled what society deemed their ultimate purpose. But for Joanna of Austria, childbirth was not a celebration. It was a slow, relentless destruction of a body that had never been designed for the violence of labor. Each pregnancy was less a blessing than a countdown. Each contraction, a reminder that her bones and blood were not fashioned for the demands forced upon them. From the moment she arrived in Florence, whispers about her physical limitations circulated through the court. Physicians privately noted her narrow pelvis, her curved spine, her fragile frame. Midwives exchanged glances when they measured her, aware that nature had not given this young duchess the structure required for safe delivery. Yet no one dared voice these fears aloud. A Medici bride, especially a Habsburg one, was expected to produce heirs regardless of the cost. Her body was a vessel, and vessels did not have the right to refuse. Her first pregnancy came soon after her arrival. Joanna approached it with a mixture of hope and dread. Hope that motherhood might bring her closer to Francesco, and dread rooted in the sharp pains that bloomed in her lower back as her belly grew. The court celebrated, but she spent nights awake, hands pressed against her ribs, struggling to breathe. When labor finally began, it lasted for hours that felt like an eternity, her body trembling under the strain. The child, born too fragile to survive, lived only a short while. Joanna held the tiny form briefly, her tears falling on the blanket, before the midwives carried the infant away. That loss did not bring sympathy. Instead, the court's attention turned to her failure, spoken not in accusations, but in the coldness with which they moved on. "She must try again," one lady-in-waiting remarked, as though her suffering were a minor inconvenience. Francesco said nothing. His silence was louder than any condemnation. And so Joanna tried again, and again, and again. Over 13 years, she endured 8 pregnancies, each more perilous than the last. Her deformed pelvis made normal labor almost impossible, forcing physicians to use brutal extraction methods that left her bleeding, feverish, and unable to walk for weeks. Her spine, already twisted, bent further with each child she carried. She often fainted from pain. Sometimes she could not stand at all without assistance. But no matter how close she came to death, Florence demanded more. The palace corridors became familiar with the haunting sounds of her agony. Servants waited outside her chamber, listening to her cries echo through stone walls, long, shattering cries that even the sternest attendants whispered about afterward. They lit candles for her. They prayed for her. Yet the court itself cared only for the outcome, a living heir. Most of her children never reached that threshold. Some were stillborn. Others died within days. A few breathed only long enough for the baptismal rites to be completed. Each tiny coffin lowered into Florentine soil deepened the ache within Joanna, a grief she was expected to swallow and move on from without pause. Only her daughter Eleonora survived childhood. Joanna clung to her with a tenderness that felt desperate, as though the survival of this one child might justify all the suffering before. But even motherhood brought no relief from loneliness. Francesco rarely visited her chamber after a birth, offering neither comfort nor gratitude. He blamed fate, illness, or God. Anything except the possibility that Joanna's body had been pushed beyond human limits. Bianca Capello, already a presence in the Medici household, became the subject of whispered comparison. Graceful, fertile, everything Joanna was not. By the time Joanna was pregnant with her 5th child, the court had begun treating Bianca as the more desirable consort, while Joanna, pale, limping, exhausted, was seen as an unfortunate necessity. Her health deteriorated rapidly. She walked with pain sharp enough to stop her mid-step. She struggled to breathe as her ribcage compressed inward from repeated gestation. Her hands sometimes shook uncontrollably during prayer. But the expectations placed upon her did not loosen. She must produce a male heir, the whispers grew. Florence needs stability. The Medici line must continue. And so she continued. One of the most harrowing labors occurred during her 7th pregnancy. The child was positioned incorrectly, trapped behind her narrow pelvic bone. Physicians attempted to turn the infant manually, while Joanna screamed until her voice cracked. The midwives begged them to stop. The doctors refused. When the child finally emerged, lifeless, Joanna lost consciousness from blood loss. For 2 days, her attendants feared she would not wake again. When she did, her first words were a prayer. A prayer in a room where no one felt mercy. Her 8th pregnancy offered no improvement. Her body swelled in ways that terrified the physicians. Her legs could barely carry her weight. She vomited daily from pain. And yet, Florence held its breath, waiting for the miracle that never came. Another infant died. Another coffin was prepared. Each loss hollowed her spirit, but none broke her faith. Joanna endured with a quiet resilience, believing that suffering was a divine trial she must accept. But privately, alone in her candlelit chamber, she must have wondered how much longer her body could fight against the destiny carved into her bones. She could not have known that the next pregnancy, the 9th, would be her last. She could not have known how close she stood to the edge of her life. She only knew this. Even in a palace overflowing with beauty, gold, and music, she remained a woman trapped inside a body that Florence never saw as human, only useful. Joanna of Austria had always known she was unloved. But she did not understand the full shape of that truth until Bianca Capello entered her life. Not as a friend, not as a courtier, but as the living embodiment of everything Florence adored and everything Joanna could never be. Bianca arrived like a spark dropped into dry grass, radiant, charming, scandalously captivating. A Venetian by birth, she carried with her the effortless warmth that made Florentines lean in when she spoke, laugh when she smiled, and whisper her name long after she left a room. For Francesco, she was not simply a lover. She was a liberation from duty, from disappointment, from the austere presence of a wife he had never wanted. The shift happened slowly at first. Francesco found reasons to be absent from the Palazzo Pitti, meetings, hunts, ceremonies. Then slowly, inexplicably, Bianca's name began to appear in the same circles he frequented. Soon, it was no longer a matter of her presence, but of her prominence. Her laughter echoing through the same halls where Joanna walked in solemn silence, her perfume lingering in rooms where Joanna prayed for companionship. The court noticed before Joanna did. They watched Francesco's eyes light up when Bianca entered a room, an expression he had never once shown toward his wife. They giggled behind fans as Bianca began wearing jewels selected by Francesco, jewels that should have belonged to the duchess. They whispered with thrill rather than shame when Francesco openly escorted Bianca to festivals, placing her in the seat of honor that protocol insisted belonged to Joanna. The humiliation was public, systematic, and cruel. Joanna learned of it not through confrontation, but through absence. She waited for Francesco during dinners, where he never appeared. She saw the empty spot beside her during court ceremonies, the spot where her husband should have stood. She attended church alone on feast days. That tradition demanded they attend together. And each time she asked where Francesco was, the servants' answers grew shorter, their eyes more evasive. He has business elsewhere. He is temporarily detained. He is visiting the villa outside the city. Never the truth, never he is with Bianca. But she knew. She felt it in the way the court shifted around her, the way courtiers avoided her gaze as though ashamed on her behalf. The way letters from home asked too carefully whether she was finding contentment in Florence. She felt it in the coldness of the bed she slept in, night after night, clutching a rosary instead of a husband's hand. She felt it in the quiet ache that lived behind her ribs, growing heavier with every day that passed. And then there was Bianca herself. Beautiful, golden, irresistible Bianca. She moved through the Medici court like a flame, brightening every corner she touched, while casting deeper shadows over Joanna. Even Joanna, devout and gentle as she was, could not avoid comparing herself to this woman who had won Francesco's heart so completely. Bianca's confidence was intoxicating. She spoke boldly, laughed freely, and carried herself with the self-assurance of someone who knew she was adored. She wore daring Venetian gowns that brought color to a court already rich with spectacle. She danced gracefully during festivities, while Joanna watched from the periphery, her thin hands folded in her lap like folded wings. Worst of all, Bianca made no effort to hide her closeness to Francesco. She walked beside him in public. She received his private letters. She rode in his carriage on days when Joanna was too weak to stand. she dined at his villa in Poggio a Caiano, where servants whispered that the walls themselves had begun to favor the sound of Bianca's voice over Joanna's soft prayers. The city took sides, and it chose Bianca. She represented everything Florence celebrated: beauty, sensuality, charisma, Venice's cosmopolitan flair. Joanna, in contrast, symbolized everything it dismissed: severity, piety, foreignness, fragility. Even the clergy, who should have sympathized with Joanna's devotion, found Bianca's charm difficult to resist. Joanna bore it all in silence. She had been raised to accept God's will, even when it came in the shape of humiliation. Her suffering deepened her faith instead of her bitterness. She lit candles for her marriage at dawn and knelt for hours each evening, praying not for revenge, but simply for the strength to endure another day in the palace, where her presence meant so little. But some nights, even faith could not quiet the pain. There were nights when she lay awake, staring at the carved ceiling above her bed, wondering how a heart could ache so deeply and still continue beating. Nights when she pressed her hand to her abdomen, scarred by childbirth, weakened by grief, and wondered if her womb had become nothing more than a battlefield for Florence's ambitions. Nights when she imagined confronting Francesco, asking him why he had never tried to love her. But she never did. Her dignity, fragile as it was, held her back from desperation. Florence, however, showed none of that restraint. Bianca was increasingly treated as the true duchess, while Joanna, thin, pale, and limping, became an afterthought. She was still addressed with the titles she had earned by birth and marriage, but titles without affection feel like stones around the neck. By the time Joanna entered her 7th year in Tuscany, the hierarchy was clear. Francesco belonged to Bianca. The court belonged to Bianca. The city belonged to Bianca. And Joanna belonged to no one. She existed in the palace like a ghost walking through the life that should have been hers, silent, unclaimed, and slowly breaking. By early 1578, Joanna of Austria was no longer the young bride who had once crossed the Alps with a heart full of trembling hope. She was thinner now, her cheeks hollowed, her posture permanently bent from years of strain. Her body bore the scars of 8 brutal pregnancies, scars that Florence ignored, scars that Francesco refused to acknowledge, scars that no prayer could mend. Yet despite everything, despite the warnings from physicians who feared that another birth might kill her, Joanna conceived for the 9th time. The news spread through the court as both relief and inconvenience. Relief because Francesco still lacked a legitimate male heir. Inconvenience because no one believed Joanna strong enough to survive another labor. The whispers were sharp, almost cruel. Will she make it? Will this one die like the others? If not, will she? But Francesco said nothing. His silence, once merely cold, felt now like consent to a fate he would not prevent. He wanted an heir, and Joanna's survival was secondary to that desire. From the beginning, this pregnancy was different. Darker, heavier. Joanna felt it in her bones before the court physicians confirmed it. Her ribs ached with every breath. Her spine throbbed with a pain so constant she stopped mentioning it. Her legs swelled and trembled when she stood. She could not walk without gripping the arm of a servant. Even her prayers grew quieter, breaking into whispers cut short by exhaustion. Her attendants noticed the change in her skin, ashen in the mornings, flushed with fever by evening. But she tried to hide the worst of it, not out of fear, but out of resignation. She knew that nothing she said would prevent what was coming. In the Medici court, a duchess did not choose her battles. She bore them. Still, There were moments when her silence cracked. One evening, after collapsing in her chamber, she asked her confessor whether God could forgive a woman who was tired of suffering. He answered gently, reminding her of duty and faith. But Joanna only nodded, too weak to speak. She had been raised to endure pain, but not even a Habsburg education could prepare her for the slow unraveling of her own body. As the months passed, Joanna retreated almost completely from public life. She no longer attended festivals, feasts, or ceremonies. She spent her days in dim rooms, heavy with the scent of incense, surrounded by a few loyal attendants who watched helplessly as her strength faded. The grand windows of the Palazzo Pitti framed a world she could no longer enter, a Florence bursting with life while she drifted further into quiet decay. Meanwhile, Bianca Capello flourished. With Joanna bedridden, Bianca's presence in the palace grew bolder, more assured. She attended events in jewels meant for the duchess. She stood beside Francesco during processions. She smiled at courtiers who treated her as the true mistress of Tuscany. Every step Bianca took upward pushed Joanna further into obscurity. And still Joanna prayed, not for deliverance, but for purpose, for meaning, for the ability to endure whatever hours remained. The final weeks of her pregnancy were a portrait of suffering. Joanna could barely eat without vomiting. Her breathing became shallow, pained, sometimes interrupted by spasms that made her grip the edge of her bed until her knuckles turned white. She developed fevers that left her trembling violently beneath blankets. Her physicians urged her to rest, but rest brought little relief. Her body had become a failing vessel, its structure collapsing under the weight of expectation. On April 10th, 1578, labor began. It was violent from the start. Joanna's screams tore through the palace corridors, echoing off the stone walls like a wounded animal. Her attendants rushed to her side, trying to steady her as she writhed in pain. The midwives exchanged fearful looks. This was not normal labor. This was the agonizing struggle of a body overburdened beyond reason. Hours passed. The child failed to descend. Joanna's pelvis, narrow, rigid, malformed, became a trap. The infant was lodged in a position the human body could not resolve. The midwives begged the physicians to intervene cautiously, but desperation overtook prudence. Brutal extraction methods were attempted, attempts that tore Joanna's weakened tissues, causing hemorrhages so severe that her sheets were soaked through with blood. Her consciousness wavered like a candle in a storm. She clutched a rosary even as her fingers trembled uncontrollably, whispering prayers that dissolved into slurred breaths. Finally, after hours of agony that no words could truly capture, the baby was delivered, lifeless. Joanna did not cry. She could not. Her body was collapsing inward, shutting down piece by piece. Her breathing became shallow, her vision blurred. The room spun as she slipped in and out of awareness. Someone tried to lift her head. She could not hold it up. Someone called for more priests. She could not hear them clearly. Her body, battered by years of burdens imposed upon it, began to let go. The child's tiny corpse was taken away. Joanna remained, pale as marble, her pulse faint, her life flickering. The women around her, those who had witnessed her years of suffering, feared they were watching her final moments. But Joanna did not yet die. She lingered in the space between survival and surrender, too weak to rise, too gentle to fight, too exhausted to pray. Her 9th pregnancy had accomplished what the previous 8 had only threatened. It had broken her completely. No one knew then that within days, or perhaps hours, Joanna's life would end in circumstances so suspicious that Florence would whisper about them for centuries. What they knew was simply this: the woman who had been sacrificed to politics, to childbirth, to neglect, had reached the absolute limit of what a human body could endure. Joanna of Austria should have been recovering. After the brutal labor that claimed her 9th child, she was expected, at least in theory, to rest under the careful watch of physicians, attendants, and clergy. But the truth was far colder. Once the infant was declared dead, once it was clear she could produce no further heirs, the urgency surrounding her survival faded like smoke. Within hours of her delivery, the palace seemed to move on, leaving Joanna in a chamber filled with silence, the kind of silence that swallows the sounds of breath and hope alike. She was too weak to stand, too weak even to sit upright without support. Fever pulsed through her veins. Her skin turned translucent, stretched thin over fragile bones. Attendants whispered that she looked more like a saint in a painted altarpiece than a living woman. She drifted in and out of consciousness, caught between delirium and a prayer half remembered from childhood. In this state, she could not walk. She could hardly speak. She could barely swallow water. And yet, somehow, according to the official account, Joanna, broken, feverish, newly hemorrhaged, managed to rise from her bed, walk across her chamber, and fall down the steep stone staircase just outside her room. That was the story Florence was told. The moment news of her death spread through the palace, a chilling stillness settled over the court. Not shock. Florentines expected Joanna to die sooner or later. But suspicion. Too many questions surfaced at once. Questions that the Medici court seemed uncomfortably eager to silence. Whispers began the same night she died. How could a woman who could not lift her own head manage to leave her bed? Why were none of her attendants with her? Why did Francesco arrive only after she had already been declared dead? Why was Bianca seen wearing black the very next morning? Too quickly for a dress ordered in haste? The rumors split into factions. Some claimed Joanna had been pushed. Others insisted she was smothered in her bed and the fall was invented to cover the marks left on her body. A few whispered of a cloth placed over her face, of hands that pressed too firmly, of a struggle that lasted only seconds because Joanna was too weak to fight. One servant swore she heard muffled voices in the corridor shortly before Joanna fell, voices that fell silent the moment she approached. And then there was the most damning detail of all: Francesco's reaction. The man who had ignored Joanna throughout her life displayed no visible grief. He made no frantic inquiries, issued no commands for investigation, shed no tears. His face remained an unreadable mask throughout the brief proceedings. Within hours, he retreated into private chambers where Bianca was waiting, her presence too familiar, too immediate, too inappropriate for a husband whose wife had just died. Foreign ambassadors, always attuned to courtly tension, began writing letters that still survive today. Letters filled with unease, subtle accusations, and quiet horror. One Venetian envoy wrote, "It is said the Grand Duchess fell, but many believe she was made to fall." Another noted, "The haste with which the court proceeds suggests a desire not to dwell on the matter." No autopsy was conducted, no inquiry was opened. No objections were voiced publicly. Joanna's death was recorded with bureaucratic efficiency, as though she were a minor courtier rather than the Grand Duchess of Tuscany and a daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor. Florence did not mourn. What it did instead was prepare. Within 2 months, an unthinkably short window by Renaissance standards, Francesco married Bianca Capello. The speed alone ignited the rumors into near certainty. The courtiers whispered with morbid excitement. The Florentine streets buzzed with dark jokes, and diplomats wrote home in scandalized tones. Marriage after widowhood should have required at least a year of mourning. Francesco offered barely 60 days. Even the church, accustomed to political marriages, expressed discomfort. But Francesco did not care. With Joanna gone, he was finally free to publicly embrace the woman he loved. Bianca ascended in brilliance as Joanna's memory dimmed into a shadow the court refused to acknowledge. Her rooms were cleared, her letters discarded, her portraits removed from walls and galleries. Servants who had worked for her were reassigned without ceremony. It was as if the palace wished to erase every trace of her existence. Yet, for all their efforts, her death refused to disappear into silence. In taverns, in private gatherings, in hushed conversations behind closed doors, Florence continued to speak her name. Some pitied her. Some condemned Francesco. Some feared that God would punish a city that had allowed such cruelty. And some simply repeated the stories, adjusting details with each telling, until her death became less an event and more a legend of treachery and sorrow. Historians today still debate what happened on the night of April 10, 1578. Many reject the official explanation. They argue that Joanna was physically incapable of standing, much less walking down a staircase. Some believe she was murdered at Francesco's command. Others suspect Bianca orchestrated the act to pave her way to the ducal throne. And a quieter group wonders if Joanna's death was the result of sheer negligence, an untreated fever, a hemorrhage, a collapse falsely reported as a fall to avoid scandal. But regardless of the theory, the conclusion remains the same. Joanna died because her life never mattered to those who controlled it. She was valued only for the children she could bear. Once her body failed its political purpose, her life became expendable. The Habsburg princess, who had endured so much pain, so much humiliation, so much isolation, met her end in the most fitting way imaginable. A death wrapped in silence, swallowed by the ambitions of others. And Florence, with its golden domes and glittering halls, carried on as if nothing had happened. Joanna of Austria's funeral should have been a spectacle of imperial mourning, an event marked by black banners, tolling bells, and a procession befitting a daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor. But what unfolded in Florence after her death was something far smaller, quieter, and infinitely more cruel. The woman who had sacrificed her youth, her health, and eventually her life to the ambitions of the Medici court left the world with barely a ripple. Her body, weakened by childbirth and bruised by the supposed fall, was prepared in haste. Witnesses noted that the attendants worked quickly, almost mechanically, as though eager to complete a task that brought them no sorrow. No grand mourning rituals were arranged. No elaborate vigil was held. Even the candles placed around her bier were few, their flames flickering more from drafts than devotion. It was said that when Joanna's body lay still in her chamber, wrapped in silk and adorned with the minimal jewelry required for a duchess, the palace hallways were not filled with mourning, but with silence. The same kind of silence that had followed her throughout her life in Florence. A silence that had become her only companion. A silence that swallowed her final hours just as it had swallowed her hopes. Francesco's grief, if it existed at all, was performed with a formality so hollow that even the courtiers who disliked Joanna felt uneasy. He ordered the basic rites, signed the decrees necessary for her burial, and stood briefly in the chapel with an expression that revealed nothing. Those who observed him noted that he looked neither devastated nor relieved, only impatient, as though he had other matters waiting for him. He did. While Joanna's body lay in state for the minimum time required by custom, Francesco spent most of his hours in the company of Bianca Capello. Their closeness was no longer hidden. They dined together, conversed with courtiers, and received visitors as though they were already the ruling couple. The palace, which had once resented Joanna's presence, now adjusted with startling speed to a new order. An order in which Bianca shone brightly, and Joanna faded into obscurity even before she was placed in the ground. The funeral procession, when it finally took place, was shockingly brief. Contemporary accounts describe it as modest, efficient, and without unnecessary ceremony. There was no grand choir, no sea of mourners, no parade of noblewomen dressed in heavy mourning veils. Only a few members of the Medici household accompanied the bier. Even some servants who had tended to Joanna for years were instructed not to attend, their presence deemed non-essential. Her burial was carried out in the Medici vaults, a place that swallowed countless lives and stories, and Joanna's was simply another chapter sealed behind stone. She was lowered into her resting place with prayers spoken quickly, dutifully, without affection. No poetic eulogies were read. No tributes to her suffering were offered. The court, which had mocked her, ignored her, and cast her aside, did not suddenly find compassion in her death. In the days immediately following her burial, Florence moved on with alarming speed. The Palazzo Pitti resumed its schedule of feasts, hunts, and entertainments. Merchants returned to bargaining in the markets. Painters resumed their commissions. The bells of Florence rang for weddings, baptisms, and civic ceremonies. But few tolled for Joanna. Her life had never been woven into the heart of Florence, and her death was treated as nothing more than an unpleasant necessity. Her personal belongings were sorted swiftly. Some gowns were sent to storage. Others were quietly distributed to minor ladies of the court. A few items, books of prayer, small devotional objects, were forwarded to convents, where no one knew her name. Her letters were read only long enough to ensure they contained nothing politically sensitive. Afterward, many were discarded. The process took less than 2 weeks. The reaction from Austria was different. Her family received the news with grief, anger, and suspicion. Emperor Maximilian II, her brother, was said to have been devastated by the manner of her death and unsettled by the speed of Francesco's remarriage. Letters from Vienna expressed concern, but political realities made protest impossible. Tuscany was not a territory the Habsburgs wished to antagonize. Joanna, in death as in life, remained a pawn too costly to defend. The people of Florence, however, kept whispering. Some pitied her, a foreign duchess who had suffered silently in a city that never wanted her. Others relished the scandal, turning her death into tavern gossip and market chatter. Children heard stories from their parents, stories in which Joanna became a cautionary tale about loveless marriage, foreign brides, or the ruthlessness of power. In the popular imagination, she was transformed into a ghostly figure wandering the palace halls. A woman who died with prayers on her lips and betrayal in her lungs. Yet the tragedy was not only her death, it was how easily she was forgotten. No monument was erected in her honor. No chapel bore her name. No festival commemorated her sacrifice. In the great artistic city of Florence, a place where beauty was immortalized in marble, paint, and fresco, Joanna left behind no portrait that captured her suffering, no sculpture that honored her perseverance, no inscription that acknowledged the quiet courage with which she endured a life of neglect. Her memory remained alive only in the hearts of a few attendants who had witnessed her suffering up close, and in the distant grief of her Austrian family, who lamented not only her passing, but the isolation she had endured far from home. For the rest of Florence, she became what she had always been, a shadow at the edge of the Medici story acknowledged only long enough to be erased. It was a cold ending for a woman whose entire life had been shaped by the coldness of others. Joanna of Austria's life, when viewed from a distance, resembles a straight and narrow corridor, one with no doors, no windows, no paths to escape. Every step she took followed a route set long before her birth, carved by the ambitions of a dynasty that valued lineage above the bodies that sustained it. She was born into privilege, yes, but it was the kind of privilege that crushed rather than elevated, that dictated rather than embraced, that demanded everything and returned nothing. Her story begins in 1547, in the solemn halls of the Habsburg court, a world built on marble, ritual, and the silent acceptance of suffering. From infancy, Joanna displayed the physical marks of the dynasty's long history of intermarriage. A curved spine, a narrowed pelvis, a frail frame that trembled under strain. These deformities were not simply medical conditions. They foretold the tragedies awaiting her. The Habsburgs raised daughters like Joanna with knowledge, etiquette, and devotion, but not with the belief that their own needs mattered. She was a child molded for sacrifice long before she understood the meaning of pain. Her marriage to Francesco de' Medici in 1565 was the first major turn in a life defined by obligations. The union was political, strategic, essential to the stability of two powerful houses, but emotionally barren. From the moment Francesco saw her, disappointment settled over him like a shadow that would haunt their entire marriage. He recoiled from her appearance, her stiffness, her foreign manners. And while he never spoke his disdain aloud, his actions, cold, distant, dismissive, made it painfully clear that Joanna had entered a home where she would never be loved. Florence, with all its artistic splendor, proved to be a hostile landscape for the young duchess. Her accent, her modesty, her severe piety, all were subjects of mockery. The courtiers found her humorless. The noblewomen found her unfashionable. The servants found her odd. They imitated her posture, joked about her walk, whispered about her failings. In this glittering yet merciless world, Joanna was not seen as a duchess, but as a foreign inconvenience, tolerated only because tradition required it. Her isolation grew heavier with each passing year, but nothing weighed upon her more than the brutal physical demands of childbirth. Over 13 years, Joanna endured 8 pregnancies, most ending in heartbreak. Her deformed pelvis made labor a near-lethal ordeal, forcing physicians to resort to violent extraction methods that left her bleeding, fevered, and permanently weakened. Tiny coffins became a recurring presence in her life. She prayed over each one while Florence looked on with indifference. Only her daughter Eleonora survived beyond infancy, a rare light in a life steeped in sorrow. As Joanna's health declined, Francesco's affection, never present, shifted to another, Bianca Capello. Bianca was everything Joanna was not: beautiful, charming, vivacious, adored by Florence. She walked through the palace with confidence, her relationship with Francesco increasingly visible, increasingly shameless. Joanna watched her own erasure in real time, witnessing the court embrace Bianca as the true duchess, while Joanna herself faded into the background like a fading fresco. Then came the 9th pregnancy, the one that would end her life. Despite warnings from physicians, despite her body's obvious collapse, Joanna was expected to endure another childbirth. The labor was catastrophic. The infant died, Joanna hemorrhaged, shivered with fever, drifted in and out of consciousness. She could not sit, could not walk, could barely breathe. And yet, hours after this devastation, The official report claimed she rose from her bed and tumbled down the palace stairs to her death. Florence did not believe it. Rumors swarmed. She had been pushed. She had been smothered. She had been allowed to die. Francesco's rapid marriage to Bianca, less than 2 months later, only cemented the suspicion that Joanna had been removed to clear a path. No investigation followed. No questions were formally raised. Her death, like her life, was swallowed by silence. Her funeral was swift, unceremonious, and deliberately small. Florence barely paused to acknowledge her passing. Her belongings were dispersed, her letters discarded, her memory allowed to dissipate like incense smoke in an empty chapel. She had spent 13 years trying to belong to a city that never wanted her. In death, the rejection was complete. And yet, when her life is viewed in full, Joanna of Austria emerges not as a passive victim, but as a symbol of quiet endurance. She survived abandonment, ridicule, public humiliation, and the violent destruction of her own body. She maintained her faith in a world that offered no mercy. She bore suffering with a grace that none of her detractors ever displayed. And though history nearly allowed her to disappear, her story persists because it reflects the hidden cost of dynastic politics. The lives of women who were never granted control over their own destinies. Joanna's life was short, just 31 years. But in those years, she revealed a truth that courts and empires refused to confront. That beneath the titles, crowns, and alliances were human beings with bones that broke, hearts that ached, and souls that sought tenderness in places where none could be found. Her story endures because it was never truly hers to tell. But now, centuries later, its echoes remain, soft, persistent, and haunting. Joanna of Austria left behind no monuments, no political triumphs, no dramatic victories. What she left instead was something quieter, something that does not shine in marble halls, but lingers in the spaces where history stores its forgotten names. The testament of a woman who endured more than any life should demand. Her legacy lives in the resilience she carried through 13 years of loneliness, humiliation, and bodily destruction. It lives in the dignity she maintained even as Florence mocked her, even as her husband abandoned her, even as her final breaths were followed not by mourning, but by indifference. And it lives in her daughter, Eleonora, who grew up hearing whispers surrounding her mother's death. Whispers that shaped her understanding of power, cruelty, and the fragile cost of duty. Joanna's story reminds us that behind every political marriage was a woman whose body bore the consequences. Behind every alliance, a soul who learned to endure. Behind every dynasty, a silence built on suffering. Her life was a quiet tragedy, yes, but also a quiet rebellion against a world that refused to see her humanity. By enduring, by praying, by refusing to let bitterness consume her, she carved out a space in history that cruelty could not erase. Today, when we remember Joanna of Austria, we do not remember her for the heirs she failed to produce or the court that scorned her. We remember her because she lived and suffered with a grace that outlasted those who used her. A fragile princess, a broken bride, a forgotten duchess, yet a woman whose endurance speaks louder now than it ever did in Tuscany's golden halls.